everybody, and welcome to this episode. I'm really excited to be talking to Jo Bartosch. She's one of the most prominent and active journalists who covers gender identity ideology and the gender wars. Her articles have been published in many outlets, including The Times, The Telegraph, Unheard, and many others. So, Jo, to get started with our conversation today, I wanted to ask you, when did you first notice that something was amiss with the transgender issue?
So the first thing when I really started to sort of recognize there was an issue, so that was 2015, and it was prisons. And there was a huge campaign to have essentially a passing bloke who, to have him moved to a women's prison. He was called Tara Hudson, and he was a violent offender. As an aside, he also worked in the sex industry. He head-butted a barman's teeth out. So, quite a violent man. And he didn't have a gender recognition certificate, but because he was quite photogenic, some sort of well-meaning young women at a university set up a massive campaign to have him moved into the women's prison estate. And he was so photogenic and all the rest of it that it just picked up a lot of support. And the prison policy was sort of almost by the back door changed to accommodate this particular violent male offender. And then I started sort of thinking about the numbers of men and women in prison and what the difference was between, for example, a transvestite and somebody who called themselves trans because Tara hadn't had any surgery. I might have had fake boobs, but hadn't had any. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute. But really, it was some friends just having a word with me and having the courage to sort of talk to me about it, because I used to run a feminist group. And I'd always had a sort of feminist understanding of gender. I'd always understood it as essentially a method of social control, a method whereby women are given a subordinate position in society and men are given so sort of a set of social codes is what I'd always understood it as. And then I had a boyfriend about 15 years ago who said, oh, that's really cruel to trans people. And suddenly I started to question myself and doubt myself. And without even realizing it, I just kind of assumed I was wrong. And I was involved in a lot of feminist groups at the time, and they all had quite a good line on the sex industry. Surrogacy wasn't so much of a thing then, but they had quite a strong line on sort of standard feminist issues. And they all towed the trans women are women line. So unthinkingly, I sort of adopted it for a while until 2015, when a couple of friends of mine just gave me a talking to, and then I was like, okay, I'll leave it a bit, because I was horrified. I was so hurt. It's strange how it was clearly an emotional response rather than an intellectual one. So I met with them a couple of weeks later, and I was going to talk them around, and they just very logically unpicked my pretty ropey assertion that trans women are women, and I realised that I'd been lied to, and then I felt very, very angry, actually, that I've been lied to. I don't like feeling like a fool, so it was never really a question of not speaking out. I think that the minute I realised I'd been duped and other people had been duped, I was just too angry not to.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you say 2015 as well, because that was the year that there was a Time magazine cover of Laverne Cox, and it said the trans tipping point. And I remember that was actually the year that I learned about what was going on as well. And I was actually at university in New York at the time, and I was kind of right in the belly of the beast at a liberal arts university with a lot of trans identifying people. And I remember I saw Laverne Cox on that magazine cover, and I wanted to understand. I wanted to be the ally, because I had been, a leftist and sort of pro gay rights and all of that. So I figured this was pretty similar. Let me figure out what's going on. And I watched some interviews with Laverne Cox, and my brain just could not see him as a woman, and I was trying to make myself. And that was the moment that I just realized that I was now at odds with all of my peers around me, which was a pretty strange experience. And it also makes me really curious about, if you don't mind saying, how did your friends get you to come around? Was it just by asking questions, or how did they change your mind?
Questions. So just sort of forcing me to think rather than feel, basically. So, well, what is it to be born in the wrong body? What do you mean they're born in the wrong body? It's their body. Why is having surgery, why does that make somebody authentic? Why does, how do they construct their idea of what it is to be a woman if they've never lived as a woman, or never been a woman? How can it, so just sort of, I think, forcing me to think about that, and also forcing me to think about, so, for example, with prisons, to think about the rights of everybody else who might have to share a prison with a man who, all the women who might have to share a prison with a man who identifies as a woman. Don't they get a say? So it was sort of just open questions about what actually it was that I was saying, and I realised that I had absolutely no basis for the assertion that trans women are women, because obviously, essentially, trans means they're not. I mean, you can kind of replace it with not. So yes, I think it was just very, very basic questioning, um, which kind of, and to start with, I was quite upset. And I think that the upset as well made me realise that there was clearly a bit of cognitive dissonance going on.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance is very real. And when you said, you don't like being lied to, that's, I mean, absolutely. Like once you see through some kind of a lie that you've been given, you can get very angry and become very interested and even obsessed with uncovering it, especially something as big as this, where it's akin to, we have to praise the emperor's new clothes or something like that, where it's just blatant denial. What was that?
Not point at his willy.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a very relevant analogy, actually. And yeah, that's a great story about your friends asking you those questions and getting you to think through what you already valued and what you already kind of understood, and just applying it to this situation. And it reminds me, a couple of years ago, I did a podcast with Mary Kate Fain, who is also a feminist journalist, and it was an episode about how to speak to people who are kind of indoctrinated in this trans cult, this trans ideology. And we reached the conclusion that the best thing to do is ask questions and not try to convince. It does seem like asking questions is maybe the only way, because once someone believes that they're on the moral side, it's hard to get them to change that without understanding that they might have a misunderstanding of the situation.
No, absolutely. And I think as well, something that gets forgotten is, I guess, we're herd animals, aren't we? We sort of have that sort of mentality. And I think it gets very easily forgotten how actually most groups that have made progress, social progress in the past have been hated. They've been reviled. They haven't been, celebrated in the mainstream media. They haven't been. And I feel that's when people sort of look back, for example, at the sort of the suffragettes and the suffragists, similarly, everyone thinks, oh yes, they smugly like to assume that they would have been on the right side of history. Oh nonsense, of course not. It's always a minority of people that are absolutely hated that make change. So I'm kind of at peace with that.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. And I remember Graham Linehan, who also has been, widely reviled and canceled for having this opinion. He said like he sleeps really well at night. And, that kind of reminded me as well. You said like you're at peace with it. So I also wanted to ask you about outlets like leftist or conservative outlets. Did you find it hard to get published at first? Did any leftist outlets ever, I kind of think I might know the answer, but ever want you to cover this issue for them?
So, as I said, this is sort of been my entry into journalism, which is odd. And actually, one of the first outlets that did publish me was the paper, essentially, of the Communist Party, which is the Morning Star. So from around 2016, 2017, I started writing for them, but they came under pressure from the unions, who threatened to withdraw funding, and that's obviously sort of where they get most of their funding from. So, though they are broadly sympathetic, they've sort of stopped Um, they've stopped covering the issue in the balance that they want with the balance that they once did, which is a shame. Um, but then, as I say, the one of the first sort of major outlets that I wrote for was in 2017. It was The Independent, who are a sort of broadly left-leaning um, newspaper. Um, and I was asked 2 weeks after the piece went out. They had a lot of complaints. There was just a huge kickback. And I was asked retrospectively after publication to amend it in line with WPATH, so World Professional Association Transgender Health Guidelines, because I'd had so many complaints. Now, I refused, and I've never had a pitch picked up by them again. So obviously there's no way of proving that that's why, but it is interesting. I've given up a long time ago. I gave up trying to pitch to The Guardian, New Statesman. There's no point. So it does tend to be right of centre or sort of libertarian outlets that will publish me. And actually, it's this issue has changed my political stance more widely. I think I used to be quite a sort of smug lefty bubble. I didn't see it as connected to other issues like critical race theory or whatever, but actually now I can see, no, it is part of a wider pattern of identity politics, and I don't think I am on the left particularly anymore. I'm not on the right either, but it has made me more open-minded, I think, about other issues that I had previously had a slightly knee-jerk, smug response to. So in a way, I'm rather pleased that to sort of found myself cancelled by the left.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very strong attitude, and I relate to what you said about this whole experience changing your larger political views, because I had a similar experience where after I was canceled on the gender issue, I did start to question some of the other tenets of the woke left. Also, I have a question about that incident with The Independent. So they asked you to amend. So first of all, that's quite telling that they received all these complaints. They clearly thought the article was fit to publish because they put it out, but then once readers start complaining, now they have an issue supposedly with the content, which is very common when you have platforms or employers and they don't actually think that you did or said something wrong, but then pressure from the mob, from Twitter, starts to make them cave and put the pressure on the person who actually was just using their free speech. But what did they want you to amend exactly? Did they want you to say that, certain things weren't happening the way they were? Because I know with WPATH, sometimes they'll say like, oh, in the guidelines, these things maybe shouldn't happen. Like, I think the WPATH changed this, but they said under 16s shouldn't get certain surgeries. And then that actually is happening. So was it something like that where they were trying to get you to change statistics or what you were describing, or what exactly was it that they wanted you to change from the WPATH?
So I had said that there wasn't an agreed upon, a sort of medically agreed upon approach to dealing with children who feel like they're in the wrong body and to dealing with gender dysphoria in children, which is true because the sort of watchful waiting, and at the time in 2017 as well, yes, at Haverstock were practicing affirmation only, but it wasn't technically agreed as the only approach. So I had said that there wasn't one approach, and they wanted me to amend it to say that there was one approach, and this is the approach that was recommended by WPATH. So that was the sort of point of contention, and I just said no.
Oh, so they wanted you to say that there was only one way, which was the affirmation path?
Which was recommended by WPATH, yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting because that's almost a little bit self-incriminating of their movement, because it's like that there should be multiple paths open if a child comes in and says, I have this issue. And we know that the affirmation model is used and mandated in certain places. So you would think they would actually want to push back and say, well, no, we do explore other things. We make sure. But no, they just wanted that to be the line. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I say, it was 6 years ago now. So, but I'm pretty sure that was what the point was. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. And then, have there been other attempts to pull your articles, get you silenced? What kind of other attempts at cancellation have you dealt with?
I think the hardest thing has been socially. So, I live outside of London, and it's a fairly small community, and I have I mean, a same-sex marriage, and yeah, I think the sort of social side of knowing that my views are considered hateful and are misunderstood has been quite difficult. It's made it difficult to, I left the Labour Party over this sort of years ago now, and it's been quite socially quite difficult because it has become a topic of conversation sort of generally now, and it's hard. Um, so from that point of view, the sort of social side of things has been surprisingly tough. It's also been an opportunity to meet lots of new people who I do agree with, which is, but it just seems like one of those issues that you can't have disagreement of opinion with and to stay friends with people. So I have lost quite a few friends over it. I think so far as my career goes, it's really hard to ever give any concrete evidence and to ever judge and to ever, and then obviously now in the UK we're very lucky because gender critical views are protected under law. But it's never, for me, it's never been that simple. So, for example, it's only the past sort of 3 years or so I've full-time made my living from journalism. Prior to that, I always had other jobs. And when I was, I'd sort of constantly applying, particularly, I was really keen to get into the women's sector and never got an interview, never got anywhere. And obviously, there's no way I can prove it was because of my views, but it does set you wondering. So actually, I think it's just that sort of gnawing, constant uncertainty that's very frustrating. So yeah, I think I don't even know who I've had. I think I've had an interview for a couple of vaguely sympathetic feminist organisations years ago. That was about it. And I was like, constantly applying and just could never get a look in. And yeah, I suspect strongly that probably my sort of fairly well publicised views have got something to do with that.
Yeah, I would imagine probably. I mean, it's like you said, you can never pin it down or prove it, but once you've put yourself out there on this issue, you always wonder. You always have to wonder if that was what it was. But have you noticed things changing at all over time? Do you think the tide is turning in the UK? Have you personally noticed a difference in the way people interact with you who maybe were afraid of association before? And is that changing at all?
Oh, hugely, hugely. And I think the change over the past sort of few years has been significant. I think a lot of it actually down to reporting on the situation in prisons and also, I think, sports. It really irritates me that it's not been men entering women's refuges, it's not been men on women's hospital wards, it's been bloody sports. That seems to have piqued a lot of people. But I suppose there's just something about the sort of the photographs of, hulking great men standing on podia or, going through the finish lines or whatever it happens to be that I think is quite striking. And I think, the whole picture tells a thousand words type thing. It really, there was no arguing with, you look at Leah Thomas, obviously it's a bloke.
Yeah.
I think that has changed things, and I can imagine, particularly in the US, seeing as you're sort of such a sports mad nation, if I may generalise. I think yes, in the UK, particularly Scotland, it's been crime reporting and the idea of male rapists in this is the only type of rapists in women's prisons. So we had a man called Adam Graham, otherwise known as Ilsa Bryson, and he was a double rapist put in a women's prison, and it finally moved after much protest. So yes, I think, but it's always hampered by the fact that the guidance that a lot of journalists work to makes it very hard to name men as men. I think actually they are allowed to do so, But I think just the convention that has built up thanks to lobby groups makes it quite difficult for them, and I think they're just terrified of being sued. So I've had, when I've written for particular outlets, I've had my language modified, my words changed, which annoys the piss out of me, but I kind of have to balance between, well, it reaches a big audience, and there are, it's quite clunky to have to say man who identifies as a woman, or trans identified man. It's not, it doesn't trip off the tongue. Trans woman does, but at the same time, there was a survey done relatively recently that shows a lot of people still think a trans woman is a woman who's transitioned into, it's not clear. So I sort of do think there's a real problem with the with trans activist language having sort of influenced journalistic coverage. But yes, things are changing, and I think it is largely due to sort of, and politicians as well. So we've had, there's the Conservatives, who ironically this ideology has really sort of bitten into the civil service, into institutions under their watch. And I think initially it's because they were quite worried about being seen as a liberal, and it was a sort of an easy win for them. And obviously in some ways it fits with the sort of, laissez-faire, do what you like, sort of, lack of hands-off sort of policy. I can see there's a sort of a conservative argument for it in UK terms. Yes, it's been under their watch that transgenderism has really captured institutions, and yet now they are making political capital out of being able to point and laugh at the Labour politicians who can't define, or claim not to be able to define, what a woman is. So, so it has sort of, I think, there's a very useful, and also, there's a political fault line that it's fractured along, and I think the sort of way that has been mined, if you like, has really put the matter into public consciousness in a way that it wasn't previously. And there's a report done, British Social Attitude Survey has shown a significant drop in the number of people since 2019 who think that birth certificates should be altered, and who believe in self-identification. So, there has been huge social progress, and sort of the British public seem to be waking up about this issue.
Yeah, there's definitely a need for people to understand what we are actually talking about. Like you said, some people still think trans woman means a woman who is trans, but that's somewhat very intentional by the trans ideologues who want people to understand it that way. And so it's hard to find the right language. It's hard to find the right words to explain this issue to a mass audience, or to a particular person who disagrees with you. And but when it comes to kids, I wanted to ask you to kind of explain to us Americans how have things have been going and have been changing over there in the UK with doing trans medicine, I'm putting medicine in quotes, on minors. How has that situation changed?
So I think there's a campaign group who have been absolutely at the forefront of this for years, and that's was the brainchild of a woman called Stephanie Davis-Eli, and they're called Transgender Trend. And from 2015, they have been pushing about this, and they've been sort of trying for meetings with politicians. They've been and they've been shut out of everything, and they've been smeared in the press. They've been smeared by politicians who disagree with them. They've had a really tough time, and just through sheer tenacity, they have managed to, I think they are primarily responsible for getting the Tavistock, which was the main gender identity clinic in the UK, getting them, or the gender identity services within it, shut down for children, which is a hell of an achievement. So it's now going to be sort of satellite clinics, and there's obviously a battle on to see which ideology, or which angle is going to prevail. Unfortunately, it looks like a lot of the clinicians have effectively stayed and been moved on, which is a problem. There's a report that is being done by a leading paediatrician called Hilary Cass, and she has basically looked at the evidence very impartially, just in a very professional way, and said that there was no evidence really that puberty blockers do in fact resolve gender dysphoria. It normally happens just through the process of going through puberty. So I think the sort of obviously the medical evidence is starting to stack up against the trans ideologues. I also think actually, although it's less well known, I think Genevieve Gluck has done some very good work looking at the motivations of those behind the protocols, so the WPATH protocols, and she found that some of the members were linked to routine pornography and fetish sites where there is an interest in castrating children. And I do think that sort of that sexual driver is, I think having that exposed is very helpful. If not to the mainstream, I think just sort of the fact that I think a lot of people is probably on the edge of their consciousness that there might be that element to it. So I think actually that's also been quite helpful. And I think stories of parents, I think the stories of detransitioners have been absolutely vital, and the stories of parents who have found that schools have gone behind their backs and have transitioned their children because they've been lobbied and because they think they're doing the right thing. So I think those have been sort of absolutely pivotal in changing the narrative. And again, having it sort of recognised as a political issue, and having MPs like Miriam Cates, who is also very interested in stopping excessively pornographic sex education and making sure that everything's evidence-based when it comes to children. I think that's been very helpful as well. So it's been sort of, I think there have been multiple factors, but I think the main organisation that needs praise, Transgender Trend, without a doubt, because they've done some excellent research, as has Michael Biggs. He's an Oxford professor. He's done some brilliant research into puberty blockers, which refuted the somewhat sparse findings which the protocol was based upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here in the US, we haven't had so much success with combating gender medicine for kids. I'm curious on your view, do you think that there is ever a case where a child would benefit from transgender treatment?
No. And I can't help thinking with the US context, probably it's lawsuits that's going to stop it, isn't it? Which is kind of depressing. I wonder how many sort of children's fertility is going to be ruined and their bodies are going to be ruined before they get there. But I think there are sort of moves. I think that's starting to happen. Seeing the question I get, I know there have been a few detransitions, haven't there, who have sort of come out and started to move things in that direction. With regards to I don't believe there's any such thing as true trans. I don't think anyone is really born in the wrong body. I do think that a tiny proportion, a minority of people perhaps suffer from gender dysphoria, and I think part of the reason for the increase in that is a bit like with the increase in Tourette's. It's clearly a social contagion born of social media. I also think there is something fundamentally unhealthy about the amount of time we all spend online, which I'm guilty of as well. But I think that exacerbates a mind-body split and can exacerbate dysphoria, particularly with the use of filters and those sorts of things, and sort of, gaming avatars, whatever it happens to be. I think that can really foster an unhealthy body image, which is, essentially what underlies gender dysphoria, obviously. So no, I don't think you can ever treat what is a psychological problem by making a physical modification to somebody's body in the same way as, there are people with automophilia, when they want to have a limb chopped off. And there are some doctors who will do it. But ultimately, I think if that's an overwhelming, whether it's a fetishistic desire or just a dysmorphic desire, I think if you have that desire, that's what needs to be treated, not the body part being removed. I think it's exactly the same with transgenderism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's this attempt to treat the psychological distress with a surgery, really a cosmetic surgery or something that's worse in a different realm, because as Abigail Schreier pointed out in her book, a cosmetic surgery, a non-trans one, is only supposed to change the form of the body part, not to destroy the function or to change the function even. So trans surgeries really do stand out in that they're more akin to, like you said, the those rare cases where people want a limb removed, and there have been, as you said, some surgeons who've actually done that, which is really, really disturbing. But and then I do want to go back to the motivations of the people who perform this medicine on children. But I also quickly wanted to ask you, do you think that it should be legal for adults to receive this medical treatment if they desire it?
See how you can stop it. I mean, and I think a lot of it is linked to pornography as well. I think that's been a real vector for this sort of mind virus, if you like. Yeah, I don't think there is a way of rolling back and stopping it. I think if adults want to spend their money and do that to their bodies, fine. I just don't think that the rest of us should be forced to accept that that means in any meaningful way they've literally changed sex. So yes, if they want to, fine, in the same way as I don't really think it's particularly healthy or a good psychological, a sign of a healthy mind to get a boob job, to be honest. But if people want to do that, fine, whatever. um, but yes, when it comes to something that it's obviously not just impacting your body, it's impacting the way the rest of the world is expected to see them, and that's the bit I object to. Yeah, people can do what they want, but don't expect to play along.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's a really good point. There's a personal freedom, but then it has to end where it comes up against, it's like that expression, my right to swing my fist ends at your head. So they have a right to do what they want with their lives, but when it comes into changing or trying to change the way society is entirely structured, when it comes to sex and gender, it's just infringing on other people's rights and freedoms. And then, so going back to the motivations of the clinicians, the therapists, the counselors, the surgeons who do this to kids. You did mention that there has been some connections shown to really creepy, really dark, sinister fetish stuff where, they actually fantasize about this stuff in a really like seedy, just fully, despicable way. And no doubt that exists. I mean, when you sit and think about it, why would an adult want a child to not go through puberty and to retain their childlike body? It absolutely raises those questions. But then there's also, the profit motive. There's some other motives at play. How much do you think is personal darkness or sinisterness on the part of the people administering this, and how much is greed or career profit motivated? How do you kind of parse that?
Yeah, I think what's the difference? So I know with just as an aside with surgeons, I know a lot of them got a very high proportion of psychopaths within surgery as a profession, and in a way I can see that you would need to be able to have that level of detachment to be able to essentially play with people's lives for your job. I mean, of course you would. So it's not even necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that means they're prone to, well, playing God, which obviously this is about besting Mother Nature, isn't it? It's about sort of, like, I can see if you have that sort of mindset, that's sort of catnip to you, isn't it? With regard to the counsellors and sort of people who probably are well-meaning, I suppose I can roll back on my trans women are women sort of brief phase pretty easily if you have built your career on it and you know what you've been effectively putting people on the medical pathway to do something pretty terrible to their bodies. That makes it very bloody difficult. if your sort of career has been based on that, and if everybody around you is sort of doing that, I can see that it's not only the sort of horror of stepping off that treadmill. It's also, the program and all the rest of it you'll have from your colleagues. It will be the sort of the ostracization. So I can see there are huge social forces and reasons why people don't want to face up to what they're doing and why it is much easier for them to believe what is, quite obviously a lie. So I don't think it's all necessarily sort of evil motivations. I think, people believed all sorts of bonkers things in the past. When you look at some sort of, religious beliefs that were considered, that were held by a majority of people, people believe absolute nonsense if enough people go along with it. So I don't think it's even that unique in that regard. Um, but yes, I think the profit motivation, I think the say fetishistic driver, and just the groupthink, um, have all sort of uh, converge to create what is a monster and a
Mhm.
profit monster.
Mhm.
Does
Yeah,
that
and
answer the question? Sorry.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's just because, and I asked a similar question in a recent interview I did with a detransitioner who, a male detransitioner. So he had at one point wanted to, be, a trans woman. He thought that he could become a woman, and, he received the vaginoplasty surgery, which for people who don't know, that's penile inversion, and that is considered the final step in a male to female transition, to use sort of their terminology, which of course they don't become female. And that's the big lie. And so I asked him, a similar question about kind of the motivations of the surgeons. And he just immediately said they're all psychopaths. They're all psychopaths. And there is truth to what you said about that surgeons in general, they're known for being kind of cold, kind of not having very good social skills or bedside manner, because that's not their role. They come in and they, like you said, to cut someone open and make all these changes, I don't even know how, you have the stomach for it, but I'm glad that some people do when it comes to
Right.
actually good surgeries, right? Like life-saving or helpful surgeries. But yeah, the detransitioner, I asked Richie, he said, they are actually akin to a used car salesman who knows exactly what they're selling. And I mean, that's a very scary and disturbing prospect for sure.
And I mean, I've seen the sort of non-binary surgeries and things are now being offered, which have an even more tenuous connection to anything medical. It is clearly for some of them about playing God. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Frankenstein-esque. It's very much it's wishful thinking or delusional thinking of some kind, to think that you can take the tissue of, like, if we're talking about vaginoplasty, to think that you can take the male genitalia and mess with it for, a number of hours in a very intensive surgery, and like dissect it and invert it and the things they do, and then somehow that you actually have a vagina at the end of that is so, I mean, it's a scarily blatant lie, but they have convinced so many people. And when you are a vulnerable person who has psychological distress, and you have a surgeon who's this position of authority, and your therapist, or maybe two therapists, and the internet and the trans community all telling you this is real, I can definitely have a lot of sympathy for it. But from the surgeon's point of view, I think there is a lot of that playing God and thinking that they are on the frontier of this incredible new, almost like a transhumanist venture. We can transcend our bodies, but we just don't work like that as humans. You can't reshape the, you can't reshape the male genitalia into the female and vice versa. So it leaves such destruction in its wake whenever they do these surgeries, as far as to caveat that, I can't speak to every case, but from the people I've spoken to.
No, quite. And it's never simple. It never seems to be just one surgery. There always seem to be follow-ups and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. I guess the last question I'll pose to you is, we talked a lot about how to kind of get across to people who are still maybe indoctrinated in trans ideology, but when it comes to kids who are going through this, who are struggling with their gender, and their parents, what do you think is the best way to get it across to them, the information they need to know? Or really, just what would you say if someone is listening and they're maybe just trying to figure all this out, and they're looking for information, and their kid is going through this? What do you think they need to know most of all, or just what do they need to think about and consider before they go into these spheres where they're going to be told, you know, trans is the way, affirmation only, and all that.
Personally, don't believe the hype about suicide. It is a lie. So there was one survey which has been repeatedly referenced in the UK. It's been referenced in Parliament. It's been referenced in newspaper articles, and it was a very flawed. It was well, no, actually, the study wasn't flawed, but the way it's been interpreted has been, and it was based on 28 self-reported patients. A good proportion of whom were then not followed up on. And it was about suicidal ideation. And it said that, 48% of so-called trans youth have considered suicide. It's not true. And so I think, yes, do not believe the lies about suicide. I think ask open questions. Try and sort of try and be clear about what your child thinks it is to be in the wrong body or to be, and to sort of unpick that. And also, I mean, to be aware of the power of gender stereotypes. I mean, I've changed my position slightly on this, and I do think perhaps there is some biological basis to some traits that are more common to, for example, men or women. But that's not a blueprint. You can be non-conforming. I think sort of recognizing how rigidly our society does police gender roles can be quite helpful and liberating in showing kids they don't have to strictly live within them. So I think that's probably something that it's quite useful to understand. And yes, so there are lots of good groups out there. There's in the UK, there's Bayswater, which is for parents of children who identify as trans. There's Our Duty, which is another group, and obviously there's Transgender Trend, for a brilliant source of information. So yeah, I think essentially, don't be panicked into making any irreversible decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the suicide threat in particular is very, very disturbing when you hear parents, you know, talk about how they were told, do you want a dead daughter? Or do you want a live son, for example, if they've brought in their little girl who supposedly wants to become a boy. And so, yeah, it's really important for parents to hear that. I've gotten a lot of comments from parents who are just, I mean, it's just so sad to see how much they're struggling in this, especially because people around them think that they are the villain for questioning this. So I think that your work is so important to them and to other people who are dealing with all of this. I think that brings us to the end. Joe, thank you so much. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you. I have actually been kind of wanting to talk to you for a while and, you know, following your work. So it was a pleasure for me. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed it. So thank you.